Indonesia 2060. Indonesia is an extraordinary development success story. When Indonesia declared independence in 1945, its GDP per capita was more than 10 times lower than today. Since then, its economic development has been an extraordinary success story. From 1968 to today, Indonesia has been the fourth fastest growing large economy in the world, joining Korea, Singapore, and China in sustaining very rapid growth over half a century. The share of the population below the national poverty line has fallen from 60% in 1917 to less than 10% today. Today, Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous country, seventh largest economy, 12th largest energy consumer, and the largest coal exporter. With growth has come transportation transformation. Indonesia's GDP fell by nearly 15% in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in 1997. In response, the country unleashed a wave of reforms, and over the next 2 decades, its economy changes substantially. Indonesia shifted from a net oil exporter to a net oil importer in 2003. The share of the oil and gas sector is GDP fell from 10% in 20th century to around 2.5% in 2021, accompanied by a fourfold decrease in the share of government revenues from the sector. No longer an oil exporter, Indonesia is still highly dependent on fossil fuels. Exports of coal and natural gas make up nearly 20% of net goods exports. Growth has led to more CO2 emissions. Indonesia's total energy supply increased nearly 60% from 20 to 2021 as energy demand rose. Coal stepped into to fill the gap. Per unit of energy consumed, its energy sector now emits one-third more CO2 than in 20. Total energy sector emissions have grown faster than energy demand, more than doubling over the last 2 decades. In 2021, energy sector emissions were around 600 million tons of carbon dioxide, making Indonesia the world's ninth largest emitter. Yet, per capita energy CO2 emissions are only 2 tons, half the global average. Moving towards net zero emissions is a key part of Indonesia's path to becoming an advanced economy. Indonesia's ambitious target of reaching net zero emissions by 2060 or sooner is an integral part of its overarching development goal of becoming an advanced economy by 2045. Despite the country's achievements, a long path to this stated goal remains. GDP per capita at purchasing power parity today is 30% lower than the world average, and economic development is regionally imbalanced and highly resources dependent. The islands of Java and Bali are home to 60% of the country population and 75% of manufacturing GDP. Other regions specializes in natural resources extraction. Indonesia's net zero emission target needs to be seen as part of its necessary transformation on their path to becoming an advanced economy by 2045. This includes economic diversification from the concentration in natural resources, economic development across the archipelago driven by knowledge, technology, and innovation, and leveraging its competitive advantage in many clean energy value chains. IEA's contribution to achieving net zero emissions as part of its long-standing cooperation with the government of Indonesia, the International Energy Agency (IEA) prepared this report, an energy sector roadmap to net zero emission in Indonesia, in close collaboration with the Indonesian Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources (MEMR). The IEA's contribution complements and has benefited from the high quality modeling and analysis that is already being conducted in Indonesia to flesh out its net zero emission target. This roadmap comes at a historic moment for Indonesia as it holds the G20 presidency for the first time in 2022 and at a time of severe turbulence in world energy markets. There is no one path to net zero emissions for Indonesia. This report presents a pathway to reach this goal, not the pathway, not the pathway. And the IEA and MEMR's joint work on this roadmap has identified a number of clear near-term priorities for Indonesia on its journey to net zero emissions to by 2060 or sooner. Our analysis is centered on the IEA's announced pledged scenario APS, in which Indonesia reaches net zero emissions on an economy-wide basis by 2060 with deep cuts in energy sector emissions. The report also develops an accelerated scenario, the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario NZE. Efficiency, renewables, and electrification are the near-term pillars. Achieving net zero emissions by 2060 is a long journey that requires immediate and sustained action. Energy efficiency, renewables in the electricity sector, and the electrification of transport need to be kick-started now. To 2030, these three levers provide around 80% of the emissions reductions from the energy sector needed to put Indonesia on the road to net zero emissions. The technologies for efficiency, electrification, and renewables are commercially available and cost-effective, provided that the right policies are put in place. Efficiency brings multiple benefits but requires substantial policy reform. Between now and 2060, Indonesia will add huge quantities of energy-consuming appliances, machines, facilities, and infrastructure to its capital stock. More than 2 billion square meters of new residential floor area are constructed between 2021 and 2030 in the APS, increasing Indonesia's residential building stock by close to 4 times the total land area of the special capital region of Jakarta. There are 22 million additional air conditioners in 2030 compared with today, as ownership rates rise from only 1 in 10 households to more than 1 in 3. Steel production increases by 5 million tons, with the equivalent of 30% today's production capacity added by 2030. The stock of passenger cars increases from 11 million today to 23 million by 2030. In this context, it is imperative that energy efficiency politics be strengthened robustly, including pricing and subsidy reform. In the APS, mandatory minimum energy performance standards for buildings, appliances, and equipment combined with politics to rapidly electrify motorbikes and passenger cars reduce final energy demand by almost 10% in 2030, relative to a business as usual scenario increasing 33% by 2060. Subsidy reform provide effective incentives to boost the efficient use of energy, including switching to electricity in some end use. Consumers save an average of USD 100 per household on energy bills in the APAs in 2030 relative to a business as usual scenario. The savings increased to USD 500 in 2050. Electricity sector rigidity risks holding back the transition. More than 25 gigawatts of solar PV and wind capacity are installed by 2030 in the APS, up from around 0.4 gigawatts today. Early growth of renewable is essential to lay the foundation for the industry to scale up strongly after 2030. This is a path to transform the current power mix, in which coal provides 60% of generation and solar PV and wind account for less than 1%. Today, generation mix is characterized by substantial overcapacity, which is the result of overly optimistic electricity demand projections in the past. Solar PV and wind for power generation have a large role to play in achieving the net zero pathway, but policy reforms are essential for them to fulfill that role. Without effective reforms, solar PV and wind projects risk being economically uncompetitive relative to coal and natural gas power plants. Recent auction results in Indonesia for solar PV and wind reveals costs twice as high as those in the comparable emerging market and development economies. A high-level policy push is needed to overcome hurdles for renewables. The critical challenge for the transition today is to create opportunities for renewables to expand their contribution to the electricity generation mix. Four key policy reforms are needed in the near term: contract adjustments to allow coal and natural gas plants to operate more flexibly and at lower capacity factors. IEA analysts suggest that this kind of contract reform can save more than 5% of costs across the electricity system in 2030, reducing curtailment of available renewables capacity and avoiding the dispatch of high cost emission-intensive power plants, reforms of existing contracts need to be done in a manner that ensures that investors receive adequate return and that confidence in the sector is not compromised. Remunerate system services provided by coal, other power plants, and eventually battery storage and demand-side flexibility. Coal continues to play an important role in electricity security to 2030, providing 5% of peak capacity. No new coal beyond the current pipeline and retire aging coal capacity. Retirements should accelerate after 2030, and the need for planned coal plants should be reevaluated. A favorable regulatory environment for development and operation of renewable capacity. This includes clear schedule for substantial competitive auctions, transparent and attractive tariffs, effective provisions for land and transmission system access, and guaranteed priority dispatch. Deep decarbonization of the uh, energy sector requires a broad suite of options. While efficiency, electrification, and renewables can deliver much of the needed cuts in emissions. Reaching deep emissions reduction calls for deploying additional clean energy technologies. For example, around a quarter of the emission reductions needed by 2050 in the APS are delivered by hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels, nuclear, electrification of some industrial processes, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage CCUS. By 2060, around 190 megawatt CO2, megatons CO2 is captured with CCUS, almost one-third of today's emissions. Total electricity generation devoted to hydrogen production is around 220 terawatt hours by 2060, almost as much as current total demand in all sectors. Energy demand centers in Indonesia are not close to its ample renewable energy resources. Interregional undersea transmission capacity is needed to interconnect electricity generation in resource-rich areas to Indonesia's demand centers. By 2050, in the APS, Java is importing nearly half of its electricity from neighboring islands. Deploying the needed technology requires innovation at the global level to bring down costs. Coordinated, cross-sectoral, and long-term planning across supply, infrastructure, and demand in Indonesia, and large investments in infrastructure and demonstration projects. International cooperation, technology transfer, and financial support will be essential. Investment in clean energy technology goes hand in hand with policy reform. Historically, Indonesia has invested around USD 20 billion per year in its energy sector. With growing GDP and energy demand, this is set to increase in any outlook. However, a pathway to net zero emissions is more capital intensive. By 2030, investment is around USD 8 billion higher per year in the APS than in the business as usual scenario. With investment in renewable generation and grids USD 25 billion, more than the current investment in the entire energy sector. Investment in energy efficiency climbed to USD 10 billion annually by 2030, a five-fold increase on today. Mobilizing this level of investment will require significant policy reforms as well as international support. Energy security is strengthened in the transition. Indonesia spent about USD 24 billion on set oil imports in 2021, and this is expected to rise to around USD 35 billion in 2022 as world price spike. By 2050, net imports of oil and gas reaches USD 1 billion in a business as usual scenario. This implies that Indonesia spends a higher share of GDP on import fossil fuels than it does today. In the APS, electrification and efficiency dampen consumption of imported fossil fuels, and the oil and gas import bill is more than 3 times lower than in a business as usual scenario by 2050. The difference in import bills between the two scenarios to 2050 is bigger than the difference in investment in clean energy technologies. This means that the clean energy transition delivers lower total energy system costs for Indonesia. Joint IEA-MEA high-level statement on net zero emissions. Indonesia announced its ambitious objective to reach net zero emissions by 2060 during the UN Climate Change Conference COP26 in 2021. Since then, at the request of the government of Indonesia, the country's Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources (MEMO) and the International Energy Agency (IEA) have been working collaboratively on detailed scenario and policy analysis of what this target means for Indonesia's energy sector. Both institutions have conducted robust and granular modeling of the pathways to net zero for Indonesian energy sector. The key findings of this collaborative project are summarized here. Indonesia's development is an extraordinary success, though largely underpinned by conventional energy sources. Indonesia has sustained very rapid growth over half a century, ranking as the fourth fastest growing large economy in the world, following Korea, Singapore, and China. Exports of coal and natural gas have contributed to this growth and to Indonesia's positive trade balance. Indonesia achieved almost full electrification of households in 2021, and the share of the population below the national poverty line has dropped from 60% in 1970 to less than 10% today. Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous country, seventh largest economy, 12th largest energy consumer, and the largest coal exporter. Indonesia's net zero objective is ambitious and achievable, despite the more than doubling of Indonesia's energy sector emissions over the last 2 decades and substantial growth in the emission intensity of its energy mix. Its per capita energy sector emissions remain half the global average. Nonetheless, both MEMO and IEA analysis find that Indonesia's net zero target is achievable through the deployment of renewable energy resources, energy efficiency, electrification, and grid interconnection. Energy efficiency and electrification are the immediate priorities. Indonesia is set to add a huge amount of appliances, cars, machines, and infrastructure this decade. In this scenario, in which Indonesia reaches net zero by 2060, ownership rates for air conditioners and the country's stock of cars increases significantly by 2030. Both MEMO and IEA modeling shows that enforcing energy performance standards, especially for air conditioners and supporting electrification of transport and cooking are critical to lower energy costs and emissions at the same time. In the near term, a policy push is needed to drive the growth of renewables. The MAMO and IEA roadmaps project that solar PV will provide as much as 50 to 60% of the installed electricity generation capacity needed to serve the much bigger demand for electricity by 2060. Important policy reforms can help to achieve this renewable expansion in a smooth and timely manner. Most importantly, policy needed to establish a stable, substantial, and multi-year pipeline of auction for renewables with competitive and transparent tariff setting. At the same time, actions need to be taken to address the current huge overcapacity of coal-fired power plants, CFPP. The capacity margin in Indonesia, particularly in the Java Valley system, is around 57% in 2022. This exceeds PLN's target capacity margin, 30%, and is 3 to 4 times higher than international benchmarks. Both MMR and IEA modeling analysis indicates no need for new coal-fired power plants, CFPP, after the current project pipeline, and projects phase out of abated CFPP by the 2050s. Coal power continues to provide 50% of peak capacity in 2030 in the net zero by 2060 pathway. However, contractual adjustments are needed to allow coal and gas power plants to operate more flexibly and at lower annual capacity factors. But these adjustments need to be conducted carefully to preserve investor confidence. Investors should be appropriately remunerated for coal plants continue to role in electricity security. Accelerated retirements can help to reduce overcapacity in the system, and international support based on the detailed assessment of plant balance sheets should be provided to help cover possible unrecovered capital. The pathway to net zero emissions by 2060 can increase affordability and energy security for Indonesia. Both the MAMO and the IEA analysis show that with the right policies in place, the total production cost for electricity would be stable in the net zero by 2060 pathway. Total household energy bills as a share of disposable income would fall by 2030 compared with current levels, thanks to benefits of energy efficiency and electrification. The energy security benefits of the transition are even more attractive in the context of today's global energy crisis. Indonesia's annual oil import bill is expected to rise above USD 35 billion in 2022 as world prices spike. And by 2030, net imports of oil are set to reach more than USD 50 billion in the business as usual scenario, meaning that even as a share of growing GDP, Indonesia would spend more on import fossil fuels than it does today. But in the net zero by 2060 pathway, the oil import bill is close to one-third lower in 2030 relative to the business as usual scenario. Indonesia is home to some of the most coal-dependent regions in the world, but it is also the world's largest producer of nickel and second largest producer of tin, both of which are critical inputs for clean energy technologies. In the net zero by 2060 pathway, the total value of Indonesia's critical minerals production reaches more than USD 30 billion annually by 2030, more than the largest ever value of coal exports. Indonesia is already taking steps to deepen domestic value added, for example, through the establishment of a domestic battery manufacturing industry. Driving further development of clean energy value chains also requires a robust domestic market for clean energy technologies. International support and cooperation are needed, while the near-term action for net zero are built around current commercially available and cost-effective technologies. Financial and technology cooperation are still critical. Indonesia will need about $8 billion in additional investment per year by 2030 in the net zero by 2060 pathway. By 2050, around one quarter of the reduction needed to be achieved through technologies that are currently not commercially available in Indonesia, including hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels, nuclear and carbon capture, UTC utilization, and storage. Deployment of these options requires innovation at a global level to bring down technology costs. In Indonesia, their deployment requires coordinated, cross-sectoral, and long-term planning across supply, infrastructure, and demand, and large investment in infrastructure and demonstration projects. International cooperation, technology transfer, and financial support will be essential. Indonesia's net zero ambition can drive the next stages in its economic transformation. Indonesia has established a goal to become an advanced economy by 2045, marked 100 years since its declaration of independence. For an upper middle income country today, this is an ambitious objective, requiring rapid, sustained, and inclusive economic growth, diversification of its current resource-intensive development pathway, and advances in its innovative and technological capacity. The development of clean energy value chains can diversify Indonesia's economy and offer new opportunities to its fossil fuel dependent regions. The drive towards net zero emissions can promote the adoption, domestic development, and export of innovative clean energy technologies, such as batteries, critical minerals, and renewables equipment, all of which have large growth potential. That's all. Thank you.